To the Writer's Dream. This is a show where authors can talk about how they write their books, how they publish their books, and how they market their books. If you would like to be on the show, or you need to ask me a question about the show, please message me on our Facebook page, which is called The Writer's Dream. We are also on YouTube. In order to see the show on YouTube, please search my name, Linda Maria Frank. My channel will come up, and please just click on the videos. And there are about 144 guests now, with lots of tips about reading, writing, publishing, marketing, all about books. You can also see the show on ltv-eh.org. Hit video on demand, look for The Writer's Dream, and you will see the episodes there as well. Today we have a guest, Jim Smith, who is a 48-year veteran of newspaper reporting and editing. He was a sports reporter. He is also the vice president of the board of Beacon House, which is for, they have homes for veterans, yes?
Yes.
Am I right about that? Okay, and I will ask you to explain that too. But he's here today because he's the author of Heroes to the End, an Army correspondent's last days in Vietnam, which I am finding a very, very compelling book. So tell us a little bit about your work with veterans now and why.
Well, for the last 10 years, I've been active with Beacon House. I originally showed up at the Bayshore headquarters to do a memo for the guy who covered Veterans Affairs for Newsday. And I found myself being drawn into the organization. And later I got $300,000 grants for the organization through my church, the Unitarian Universalist Congregation at Shelter Rock in Manhasset. And then I was named to the board. I was president for 2 or 3 years and then stepped down to VP. And you know, we have 44 locations with almost 400 beds, a $7 million budget, and about 100 employees.
Wow, that is terrific. So you deal with homeless vets?
Yes, and we have a variety of programs funded by Suffolk County, New York State, and the federal government. And depending on a veteran's situation, some of them we ask to pay a little bit of rent. Some are rent-free until they get their feet back on the ground. And it all depends on the programs.
And so you've been at this for, what, 10 years now? So you're seeing the veterans coming out of the Gulf Wars, I would imagine.
Yes. And, you know, the figures that we hear are 22 veterans committing suicide a day in the United States. And of course, you know, we've had a few on suicide watch on occasion. Most of them present multiple disabilities. So the same guy who might have, you know, a foot ailment due to diabetes could also be wearing a pacemaker and then have suicidal thoughts because he feels he's a burden on everyone else.
So you still, I would imagine then you're still getting veterans from previous wars.
Yes. Most of our clients are Vietnam-era men.
Because they were so badly treated, I would imagine.
Yes. That's why the greeting among Vietnam vets when we meet each other is welcome home, because nobody did welcome us home.
Yep. Yeah, I remember it well. So what made you write, first of all, explain the book and the way you wrote it, because it's different from ordinary memoirs of people being in Vietnam, and then why?
Well, it's total nonfiction, meaning everything in it is true. Nothing is embroidered or blown up to make me look good. It's based on 70 or more articles I wrote for Stars and Stripes as a correspondent from January 1 to August 1, 1972. And, it's a labor of love. I'm $12,000 out of pocket, but by the same
Welcome to the club.
the same token, I've raised $12,000 for Beacon House by donating my appearance fees from 110 speaking engagements and book sales of about 550 books so far. So, my old notepads from Vietnam have red grease pencil notations that say "for the book." So I knew someday I would write it. I had been a Newsday reporter for 4 years before I went in the Army. But I just didn't know when. And then, with 33 years as a sports reporter, 5 Super Bowls, 9 Stanley Cup Finals, the last thing I wanted to do when I took a vacation was write. And so I had to wait until I retired December 31 of 2014 to really dive into it. And it took me about 7 months. I had written a manuscript in 1999 when my job was converted to editing, and walked it around to mainstream publishers, and nobody wanted it. So I put it on the shelf. And then 15 years later, I took it off the shelf. And, I would say 2/3 of the original manuscript made it, but I added 1/3 more, and I made it better. And then I self-published through iUniverse of
That's who I used for my first 2 books, so,
Bloomington, Indiana.
yeah.
And, I don't have a problem with iUniverse as far as, the cover, the marketing, the website, all like that. But I feel I wasted $3,500 because they gave me an edit that I explicitly did not ask for. I said, I do not want this book to go chronologically from day 1 through day 180. I want groupings of similar topics based on a book I had read about I think it was Ring Lardner, a look at the boxing industry, where he had done, the fighters, the cutmen, the gamblers. So, I was doing the combat heroes, the do-gooders, the invited guests, the South Vietnamese, that's what I wanted. So I wound up throwing out the iUniverse edit completely and edited myself.
Yes, I found that was the worst part of dealing with any of the self-publishing houses that I've dealt with, is they do that edit, and it's not helpful. It's because it's not what you want in the book. And also, I found that now I was not an English teacher; I was a science teacher. So as far as grammar and punctuation and whatnot, I was okay in school, but I'm not an editor. But it wasn't the flavor I wanted. They would do things to destroy the flavor of the book.
Yeah, well, I told them specifically that my best stuff is related to combat heroes. It's like 15 chapters, and I wanted to go with.
It's compelling.
I wanted to go with that first, so I wouldn't lose writers in the mundane stuff about working at a base camp, playing touch football in the rain. I wanted to get that stuff in, but in the back of the book, after hooking people in through the combat stories.
Now, you specifically wrote the book about the very end of the war. Why did you choose that?
Well, that corresponded with my tour, and as it says in my biography, I had to be basically thrown out of Vietnam screaming and kicking because I had 2 requests to have my tour extended denied. And I had to come home after a year. I wanted to see the thing through to its conclusion. I knew the end was coming soon. I had a girlfriend in Saigon that made matters better. And, so I was sad to come home. But, the last days of U.S. involvement are what the book deals with, Americans trying to do good things as the war wound down. I had no experience with atrocities. All of my interactions with Americans were good. And albeit, I was steered to positive stories by the Defense Department information offices, and some of my stuff was censored or outright not printed. But I was able to get some of that material in the book that never made it into print
Sure.
before.
Sure. That's what you can do with a book that you can't when you're working for the government, because most of your stuff went into Stars and Stripes, right?
Right.
Which is the, for want of a better term, magazine of the Army. Is
It was
just
a
the
daily
Army, or
newspaper.
Is it
Daily newspaper for U.S. servicemen in
all
the
servicemen?
the
Yeah.
Pacific.
Okay. Now, how did it change you?
Well, it was a tremendous relief. I mean, I always thought I was going to die before I would get this thing printed, and I had written a book on a giant linebacker, Harry Carson, from McGraw-Hill in 1986, got to split a $50,000 advance, and I was well known in pro football writing and magazines, and so now here I was, 30 years later, to see if I could still pull this off. And thank God I had gotten some of this material down in 1999, because by the time I was ready to write in 2015, I was telling myself, oh my God, I don't even remember this story. I'm glad I got my notes down in 1999.
Never throw your notes away.
Exactly. But, then I kept writing and rewriting and rewriting. And finally, I decided to actually tear up and throw out my Vietnam notebooks so that I couldn't rewrite anymore. I had to say, I'm done. Like I didn't want to let the project go. And then finally I guess it was about late May of 2015, I finally, said enough, that no more rewriting.
But how did the experience that you had in Vietnam, did it change you? And
Well,
if it did, how so?
You never forget.
Because you were young.
You never forget the scent of death, and I was 23. Taking photos of Viet Cong bodies lying in the wire at a fire base they had failed to overrun, and seeing a fatigue jacket of a guy I knew who was now dead, having his head blown off by a B-40 rocket, a guy who had asked for assignment to a hot zone from an information office where he had been steering me to puff pieces on the Army. So, how did it change me? I really put the whole thing in the closet for more than 20 years.
That's interesting.
I never wore my uniform. I didn't join a VFW or an American Legion post. I only joined the Port Washington VFW post last year, post 1819. They immediately made me the adjutant because that's the note taker at the meetings. But, how did it change me? Well, in 1975, when they were pushing the helicopters off the carriers, when Saigon fell, 3 years after, 2.5 years after we had left, all our troops were gone and the South Vietnamese were overrun. I had what amounted to a nervous breakdown. I was in my mother's bathroom and I just slid to the floor and I was crying and my nose started to bleed for no reason at all. And I was pounding on the wall saying, 58,000 dead for what?
Yeah.
And so how did it change me? I joined Veterans for Peace. I joined Amnesty International, and I had changed from dove to hawk to dove to hawk in my college days, but I would say that I'm pretty much of a dove right now.
Yeah, but I think you were fortunate enough not to have to see the worst of it, but you saw enough of it. And
Yeah.
I think even watching the Ken Burns series on Vietnam, because I lived through it, not lived through Vietnam, but watching the news and whatnot, it was very painful. So the fact that you were able to put it in the closet, so to speak, and live your life was fortunate, because I think also the change in the attitudes of the American public towards veterans enables you to bring it out and examine it and realize that you were totally entitled to your feelings.
Well,
It's a hard thing.
I had what I call 3 lost years, from 1973 to 76, when I met my wife, who's, been a social worker now for 20 years and has helped me cope with a lot of feelings and memories. But during that period, I was driving through service stations to pass slow-moving garbage trucks. I had Jack Daniels in a open bottle under the seat and used marijuana periodically, and I was a mess. I had a DWI conviction. A couple of times I fell asleep with my head on my typewriter at Newsday. I'm glad I was able to retain my job and snap out of it. But, that's one reason why I identify with our Beacon House clients who sometimes have substance abuse or other issues, and we allow them space to get their heads together and return to independent living.
Oh, what's the expression there? But for the grace of God go I.
Exactly. I walked in their shoes, and I feel for them.
Oh,
And
doubt.
when you say I missed the worst, but I saw enough,
You saw
that
enough.
hits it right on the head, because, I was in the nightclubs when 1st Cavalry Division helicopter pilots were drinking till 1 in the morning and saying, good luck tomorrow, and not knowing who was going to return. And sometimes they didn't return. And, John Paul Vann, the senior advisor in 2 Corps, the Pleiku Kontum area, was shot down and killed in June of '72. And he was the subject of Neil Sheehan's book, A Bright Shining Lie. And he's, the closest thing to a hero that war produced. And I knew him, and he's a chapter in the book. And so, 6 people I knew were killed and had written about, including Alex Shimkin, a Newsweek correspondent.
Yeah, well, one of the things that struck me when I was reading the stories of the heroes was their desire to re-up, to come back. Because what struck me about that was that's also true. You hear this from the Gulf War veteran, the Gulf War soldiers who whether they're out of it or they're going to be sent back or whatever, they want to go back and be with their buddies because there is no sense of camaraderie like the sense of camaraderie they have with their buddies in battle. And they miss that feeling so much that living amongst the rest of us is very difficult for them.
And, you know, war produced an adrenaline rush in me.
I can imagine.
I mean, I used to run for the nearest chopper, and I didn't care where it was going. And sometimes they had to put me down in the middle of nowhere because they were scrambled for, you know, removing
raid.
wounded people
Oh, yeah, that's
from the battlefield. And thank